Hi, everyone. Angela Howard here, CEO and founder of Call for Culture and the host of the Social Responsibility at Work podcast. It's good to be with you all today. I am really excited for this conversation because it's been a long time coming, right, Dav and Andrea? It's been It's been a conversation over many talks, many coffee chats. And I think the reason it took us so long to get here was because there's so much happening in the world. And one of the things that we mention at Call for Culture is if it's happening in the world, it's happening at work. And you two have been my partners in this very large-scale brain process of thinking about inside out and outside in culture, and how we've talked about the small c, the little c, the small c and the big C, and how they kind of come together when we talk about misaligned culture or diagnosing culture or what needs to be done next to change culture. And so I think we have a really special conversation prepared for you all today because Dav and Andrea come from two very different but synergistic worlds of how to approach this work. So I'm going to bounce it to you both to do introductions. Dav, let's start with you, and Andrea will go to you next.
Right on. Well, thanks so much for having us on. And you're right, the content that we discussed early on is just completely gone out the window, and it's all totally new, which is exciting. So I'm an experience designer, and I've designed lots of things over my time. I worked at IDEO for years, developing products and experiences and new offerings for companies. And now I'm working more and more in designing culture. And so I partner with Andrea to design culture for organizations, which allows them to really kind of make good on their mission, values, and purposes, and also to be aspirational and to go after new offerings and kind of shift strategically. I'm particularly interested in story and play. So those are the two techniques. I worked in film for, worked with the Toy Lab and the Design First Play Studio at IDEO. And so I feel like story and play are two ways that allow me to help groups break through barriers that they otherwise wouldn't be able to break through. And that's me in a nutshell. I'm going to pass the mic over to Andrea.
Thanks, Dav and Angela. So good to finally be on this call with you. Many cups of coffee. And I think that ultimately we're here at the right time, having the right conversation, I hope. So I'm an org designer. So Dav, experienced designer. I am a designer of orgs. And when I say orgs, obviously organizations, which your audience will know well. And so what I think about are systems. How do you build systems that are resilient, responsive, human, pragmatic? So I'm thinking about the little c, the culture that one might find themselves in an organization or institution, and how the big C is interplaying. So I come at culture from the inside out. Dav often will say he's come at culture from the outside in. And often our clients will call him for, we need a new experience design, a modernization, digitization of their offering. And then he'll run into the organization, the little c, that poses challenges to that transformation. So that is how we have come together over the years. We've known each other for a long time, and now we're really collaborating and at scale. So that's me. I too am aspirational, like Dav. I like to look at how can work aspirationally. Can people feel a sense of belonging and fairness at work? Those are the types of questions that I like to ask. And though hard, it just at this time, it's really, I think, important to believe that humans can build for the future and not to be so fearful about changes or the crumbling of something that is happening now that we hold dear. I think our job is to keep our eyes on the prize and what's new, what's different that we need to build together. So that's me.
I love that. And Dav, I would love to start with the outside in. From your perspective, what I'm hearing is, you're taking the approach you're taking is really from the human experience perspective, where we're kind of combining storytelling, we're combining these very human experiences into what kind of transformation that can happen internally. So tell me a little bit about things that are happening right now that are really impacting your work when thinking about this from the outside in.
Sure. So, and just to explain the outside in, so my history at working at IDEO was designing new offerings for organizations. And oftentimes they were net new offerings. So instead of an incremental change to what they were doing, it was like, what's a whole new offering, a whole new business area, a whole direction that we can move in. And this is not uncommon idea, but one of the things that we realized over time is that designing a new offering that's radically different from what an organization has dealt with before is kind of like bringing home a puppy, or maybe like a baby giraffe or something like that. And so, wow, the puppy may be beautiful, or the giraffe may be like a gorgeous creature, really well-designed creature. If the organization isn't set up to support it and to nurture it, then it doesn't really matter how well designed it is. It's just not going to work. And so what we learned is that when creating these offerings and designing them with organizations, I worked on the outside, like the external offering, and then found that there was a lot of attendant work on sort of the back end or internal systems. And even more than, there's the obvious like talent and processes and capabilities that an org would need to develop. But actually, a sneaky, kind of quiet and almost invisible one is the culture. So, for example, like an organ, there's different kinds of organizations. Some get successful by doing it cheaper and more efficiently than others. Others are successful by doing it better than others. Sometimes organizations want to make that shift, but going from like an organization that's all about efficiency into an organization that's all about innovation or creativity or really connecting with their audience it requires just a totally different approach and a totally different culture. And so I've taken the tools that I've used over the years for developing these new offerings externally and started to apply them internally. Oftentimes, like I said, they take the form of what I call games. They wouldn't necessarily be recognizable as a game, but I love to play with clients and to create games and activities which allow them to break through. Sometimes, like, for example, with story, for example, sometimes it's just easier about somebody else having a very similar issue. Like, a friend of mine has this issue with communication at work or with power dynamics at work. And sometimes it's just much easier to put it into another voice or to play a game and to be more open and honest and candid in environments. So that's what I really specialize in. I love to create bespoke games or activities that allow groups to kind of transcend and barriers that would otherwise block them. So anyway, I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah.
That's outside in. So I'm moving more and more inside organizations, and Andrea is going the other way, and we're like, oh my gosh, we should make this a thing. We should do this together because peanut butter together maybe.
And I would say, the next, and I understand and I see why you would need those two puzzle pieces to come together, because we just haven't created workplaces that naturally do some of the things you're talking about, Dav, right? You're talking about people need to be vulnerable and open and adaptive, and there's a behavior shift or a shift in climate or environment to get some of the outcomes you're talking about. So Andrea, tell us a little bit about what that looks like. What are the conditions you need to create for a culture to accept some of the things that Dav is trying to do, to transform and to get them to the next level?
Yeah. Dav and I joke that when we started to sketch out, oh gosh, we're coming at the same problem from two different ways. We would joke that I got called for the boring stuff and he got called for the fun stuff. But the truth is that, yeah, thanks. The boring shit sometimes is the HR stuff, right? And so one of the things that we run into often is people call us when there's a problem. I'll get a phone call like, the trust levels are low. We need to reorganize because our business is softening. We are really struggling with two teams coming together. So Dav and I do have a background in story. I often will think about the human side and then also the data side and how do we structure and scaffold for these times. So we both have a background having worked in around film, Dav more directly. I worked at Lucasfilm for 10 years. And part of what I loved about that work was thinking about the alchemy between different cultures and subcultures at the time. And that stuff is hard. So when you've got engineers who are, patenting new technologies for film, and then you've got creatives who are trying to imagine the story, you have interesting grist for the mill for creativity, but you also have really tough things to work through in terms of style approaches to work. And so I often will talk about in my story. I'm the baby of 6 kids. So I grew up watching people work in a system. So that problem is how I found myself in HR. I really didn't think I'd end up in HR. So that is where I come at it from a systems perspective with a background in public policy, education, psychology. I often was looking at how is the system working for us now? So to answer your question, I don't think the tools and the systems that we have grown up with, top-down hierarchies. We still teach students when they come out of colleges, it's time to get these next sets of skills and you will rise up and go through the ranks of a major company. Those are not the realities of companies today. We all know this. And really, employees are showing us that every day when they vote with how they engage with work, right? They're thinking about new ways to do their work so they can blend work together. And so what we start to see in this, and Dav and I talk about this with clients, is it's ultimately right now in our culture looking like a power battle. Who has the power? Is it leaders? Is it employees? Well, those are difficult things to break down. So typically the tools that we're bringing are more responsive. We have a culture operating system model that we use that helps us map out where's the pain and why is the pain in a operational system or an alignment system or in the relational, like emotional culture system. When we can start to talk to people or use tools to get at the real, then we can zoom in on that challenge. And then slowly, as we build trust with the client, zoom out and say, okay, so what is this telling us now? But I'm a big believer in the systems haven't worked for decades for work. I'd argue, education and institutions like universities and colleges are really not yet scaling to what I think work is going to be. So that the real skills are around how do we work with one another? How aware am I of myself and my process? How do I put that work together with others? And who's helping us guide what tools we pick up? So we scaffold, we bring in new tools, we help people unlearn and then relearn. But we try to bring the play and fun back into it because the truth is working together is hard when you have differing points of view, but it also can be creative, fun, and energetic. And that's why I love bringing Dav into clients because it totally shifts. We get out of the intellectual and into what's possible. So that's a little bit about why the tools need to adapt for today.
Well, I mean, something we've talked about as a group quite often is, the tools that make up work or the models or even the behavior or the norms really date back to the Industrial Revolution, right? And we see this string through that has been repeated and perpetuated over decades. And we are now at a key pivot point where people are saying, you know what? I'm looking to move up the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? It's now not just about a paycheck and basic needs, even though those things are still in some cases lacking when it comes to work. And we're still fighting for those things. But we're really looking to this idea of, work as a place where I can contribute my best talent, and work is a place where, as from a human experience perspective, I can thrive. And we're kind of creating the conditions or the environment to get the brightest out of people and doing that in a sustainable way. So we're not burning people out. We're not having people work a million hours, and we're creating room for equitable design and inclusion and how the outcomes may look different for different people, where in reality, we kind of designed it for one type of person. So we're seeing this tension, I guess. And Dav, I would love to hear from you what needs, I guess maybe my core question is, what are some core things that need to adapt, knowing this very moment in time when it comes to the things happening in the world? What are some things that need to adapt for the next 10 to 20 years?
Wow. Well, it's interesting.
That's a big question.
It's a big question. Well, we were talking, I just kind of want to pull out that word tension that you used and also Andrea used several times. And I think it feels like tension's at the heart of it. Like you were talking about these anachronistic systems that are like, our legacy back to the Industrial Revolution, and we're kind of still stuck with them. And there's people that want to change. And you were talking about Maslow's hierarchy and the top of the pyramid. And I think what's really interesting is that there's this tension between our aspirations to get to the top of the pyramid, but that the way to get to them is actually kind of more from the bottom. It's sort of this combination of top and bottom. And what I mean by that is that where I find, and this happened with a client our first client that we worked together. I joined Andrea for a workshop where the workshop really kind of oscillated from like in the weeds, super tactical, super mechanical stuff, like really kind of basic stuff like Andrea was talking about, kind of the boring stuff of like, how are we going to meet? How do we talk to each other? How do we write an email? How do we make a decision? Those kinds of things. But then we would on that stuff, and then so that we could work on the aspirational stuff at the top of the pyramid. Because if you can't talk to each other, if you can't make a decision together, if you can't have conflict and move through it, then you never get to the top of the pyramid. It's like these super basic tools. They're almost like kind of preschool level tools that people, in order to clear the way so that like break through those barriers, like can allow them. And tension is one of those things that we talked a lot about, and I want a specific example of what we did. I worked on a project for Microsoft where they were shifting their focus from the individual to the team. And so they were really interested in like, what makes a team work and how to work? What does team mean? What does good team look like? And, one of the things that we realized about, in particular, diverse teams, which outperform, as we know, homogenous teams, is that tension is the constant in a good team, because tension, it sounds bad, but tension is just raw energy. It is not good. It is not bad. It is just energy. And it is the energy that comes when people come together. That energy can be used to propel the team to outperform other homogenous teams, or that tension can just explode the team. And it's all about whether or not it's possible to harness that energy. And oftentimes it's like Andrea always says, I was working with one of my clients, and I said, decisions keep coming up, like decisions. Why? Decisions always come up first, because that is where the rubber meets the road. And that is the hardest work that people do on a daily basis. And so how me and Andrea design our work is that we oscillate. So, and I just wanted to bring up this idea of the butterfly, which is something that we had like an emergency triage the night before we did our workshop, and we kind of had to scrap a bunch of stuff and come at it. And Andrea was saying like, there's a lot of tension in the room, and we got to manage it, or else we're just going to get nowhere with this group. And so, this is, and I worked a lot on tension. And so I was like, how about the butterfly, the idea of the butterfly? And sometimes like this kind of preschool level, these kind of really simple things, I even used a children's book illustrations to talk to them about it. But if you think about a butterfly a caterpillar going to its cocoon and then coming out a butterfly, its tension just is hard. There's growing pains. And so what we did is we created for the day where we had people make little Post-it butterflies and draw on them. And we're basically saying like, when you feel tension in the room, just start to flap your butterfly, can kind of flap it around a little bit. And people totally did it. And I thought it was going to be kind of like a one-day thing where people could start, there you go, she's building her butterfly. You can build it anytime, because all you need is a Post-it or two or a piece of paper. And years later, sends me these cute little photos of like people like on boards or whatever, little butterflies here and there all over the organization, because sometimes it's this like aspirational, like this really simple idea that you can capture in an image or in a story that be high level, that can kind of unlock these really low level tactical things that just allow you to do the things that you really need to do and want to do.
I absolutely love that. And, it strikes me that it is kind of these simple symbolic moments of human connection where we're all resonating with a similar thing. And I think, if I look at this from like an anthropological perspective, right, which I know we talk a lot about, which is we're talking about humans who haven't evolved much. I mean, we think we're really smart,
Yeah.
But the only thing
Yes.
that's really evolved is like our environment and like progress. The modern environment has evolved, but we are still very core. We love storytelling. We love like getting around the campfire, right? And sharing stories. We surround our lives with going to dinners and connecting with people. There's just these core things that I think we've eliminated from the workplace almost, that's why it feels so sterile.
Yes.
I'm watching Severance right now, like much of the world. And it's such like watching it is so, it's so validating around like some of the issues we have to deal with. I mean, it's so exaggerated, but it is true that there's this sterile film that we've put around the workplace and the environment of how we work together. So I don't know, Andrea, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, you were talking about, we really are still social animals that, at many times in the day, we work from the back of our brain, the amygdala, the lizard brain. And so part of this is play gets us to loosen and start to access other, the prefrontal cortex. So I often will be thinking about the neuroscience behind things. We'll be thinking about that data, but we're creating a very lo-fi experience that allows the tension to dissipate for a moment so that we can create a new opening to then go do hard things as a group. So then we will touch on, Dav talked about this oscillation. Those butterflies still are in the room because then we go into, all right, we need to strategize who has what decision rights. Well, talk about touching on very base needs, right? Where's my status in this group? So we'll bring in neuroscience. I've studied belonging a lot. I worked at Airbnb for a long time. And with the mission being to create a world where anyone could belong anywhere, we studied belonging deeply. And so we will bring those layers of need for belonging, which is a fundamental human need without which we would die. We evolved as social beings. So I think that just bringing in that, do I belong here? What do I need? We call that the I. Like if I feel like I belong and I'm safe, then I can take risks and say something aloud in a group or take some sort of creative risk that will help us problem solve. And then the we component, that's the relational component. We work with the teams, particularly the leadership team with this client. And we brought in a team coach who's trained in family systems therapy. He does executive coaching, but he also does this type of work, which is we all are bringing ourselves to work and we need to develop a little bit more shared consciousness of one another, of our story, of what triggers us. And we need to speak into that space at times to allow others to know I'm above the line or below the line. We have new tools to just talk about the human experience because this team is so brilliant. They're a very, very smart organization. They're a foundation trying to solve massive problems in the Midwest around race and racial equity and economic justice and climate change. So these are complex topics. And so when we can help them clear, elevate, and then work on problems together at that we level, then when we start to talk about the it, like what are the processes, the frameworks we're using to support us in that? We might use design thinking tools like 6 thinking hats or the idea of above the line, below the line, where am I emotionally today? And we all know that changes in a day and an hour. And that allows them to ultimately look at the outside world and figure out how do I sense, for example, if you are an organization leading racial equity in this time, imagine all the threats you're confronting. So you need to be super fortified as a leadership team to then not react to the new administration's attacks on some of the work that is central to their mission, but rather to respond. So they're doing a great job, I think, of pulling together and saying, how will we govern, lead, and inspire others in their sector to keep going? Because what we're doing is still on purpose, on the right path. We know this. And let's be smart and let's be strategic and let's build bridges where we can. Let's build coalitions. And that to me is super inspiring. And knowing that we get to have a hand in helping build that psychological safety and that structure and those butterflies start to form and people can see like, oh, I know someone is not feeling great right now, or I'm really excited because we just broke through. So that butterfly can go both ways, and Dav really raised it in that way. And it now is a symbol in a huge organization. And even I've seen a butterfly waved by the executive director with the board.
Wow.
So it's really a transformative, simple tool in a complex system that is trying to do complex work in the world. So these things are not trivial. And we're really trying to, get all of us out of our heads, because that's that protective mechanism. I think our culture thinks we can think our way out of any problem. Data will help us out of every problem. Well, I'm a big believer in data, and I love smart people, and that gets in the way of change sometimes too, if we can't access those other human sides of us and really have some common language. So Dav does that beautifully, and we can keep moving with the different support we bring to this organization and different skill sets that help this team really respond to today's. They talk about it as meeting this moment. We are not running from our mission. We are going to meet this moment with bravery, with empathy. So it's a very exciting client to work with, and it's one of many that Dav and I can play together with.
Yeah, speaking of, I think, meeting the moment, one of the other kind of strings of topics that we've talked about as a group is, kind of the sector that we've kind of shifted to in this conversation, which is one, I think, mission-driven companies, right? This is something that I think a lot about, especially now as we're going into the new administration. There's this backlash on DEI, and there's all these, social enterprises, organizations, or cultural institutions in particular that are responsible for moving progress in society. So, we've talked about how, I've worked with museums, you all have worked with other cultural institutions, and this topic fascinates me because what I find in working with clients like this is, although there's an outwardly, the outside big C is so influential in moving society forward, progress forward, oftentimes there's messiness internally, right? There's some sort of dynamic, or there's kind of this lack of awareness that the two are connected. Like our internal cultural efforts feel disconnected to the external or the outside facing work that we're doing. So tell me, and Dav, maybe we'll go to you first. Tell me a little bit about what that means to you, if that resonates, and how that shows up from like an example standpoint.
Yeah. So I think, we were talking about a title for this being, what was it? Something about creative leadership or resilient leadership in times of change. And, I think the thing about moments like this is that, and the change is, there's so much change right now. There's political change, there's cultural change, there's technological change, and each one of them are massive. Like they're bigger than we've experienced recently. And so I think what, the things that slow down an organization from making decisions, making good choices, is it becomes critical and become kind of a matter of survival, really, in moments like this. And maybe I can tell you about a little project that me and Andrea are working on like right now. In fact, it's still under development. We haven't finished it. It's like being formed, and I'm really excited about it. And basically, it's for this client that we've been working with, which is going to have a lot of challenges, and there's going to be a lot of fires in a lot of different places. This is also an organization that has stated and is in the process of distributing power and distributing decision-making and empowering autonomy across the organization. So it's not going to be like a top-down organization. So it's lots of people making decisions. So when there are fires popping up here and there and everywhere, the speed with which the organization has to respond is absolutely critical. And so me and Andrea have really been thinking about we've been working on lots of tools and everything, and all of a sudden everything's coming to a head where these have to come together and be coordinated and synchronized. And the group has to work. And the vision that keeps coming up for me is like a flocking system. I've been kind of Biomimicry lately. And if you think about a school of fish, like one of the fish sees a shark and it's like, let's go that way.
Yep.
And the whole flock goes with it. And we've been thinking about like, how can you have lots of different moving parts, autonomous moving parts, while at the same time keeping them aligned to the values and to the purposes of the organization, even though it's totally unpredictable actually what that purpose is going to look like, what that mission is actually as it gets executed. And so we have this idea about the character builder, and this is based on an experience that I had myself working in film. So I'd oftentimes get a project and they would say, design the title sequence or design in this film. And I'd be like, okay, great. Send me the script or send me a cut. And they'd be like, sorry, we can't do that. Top secret. And I was like, I can't design if I don't know the goddamn story. Like that's impossible. And so this happened. Yes. So what I would do is I would basically just invent my own story. And I would start to build characters and I would start to have them interact. And with world building can go on forever and ever. And so I had to figure out like, when do I have enough, like the minimum viable story or characters to actually start to design? And basically I realized this, it sounds a little bit crazy, but I would ask myself, so what I would do is I'd build these characters and I'd ask them questions. And when I would ask them a question and the answer surprised me, that's when I knew I had an, because at that point, and remember, this is all in my head. So I'm actually answering my own questions in my head. But when this character that I was building would surprise me with their answer, that's when I was no longer writing the character and the character was writing itself. And that's when I knew that I could ask them lots of questions. And this thing about asking lots of questions, people in an organization are going to be asking lots of questions every day. What do I do? How do I handle this? Whoa, how am I going to deal with this fire over here? How would I put this out? And back to values and purpose and mission is kind of an abstract exercise that requires a lot of math and kind of like talking or thinking or whatever. And we're looking for something that can be much more intuitive, much more gut level, much more real time. And so what we're doing, and here's the big idea. We're going to take all of the work that mostly Andrew's been doing with this organization, the values, the operating principles, the purpose, the mission. We're going to put all that together and we're going to have it make sweet love and give birth to a character. And the character is going to be of the aspiration, and the purpose. And we are going to build that character so that so it's like a friend, so that if I said, what is your friend going to eat for lunch? Or how would they put out this fire? Or what would your grandma do if someone came knocking on her door and did that? Or what and think about it. If you ask Mahatma Gandhi, or if you ask Obama or Michelle Obama, you ask Trump what they're going to do in a situation, they're going to come up with very different answers. So if we can build this character and make it real enough that the whole, and then like ask questions of and be guided by, we're thinking that that's just going to help them to all make decisions according to this, not just like abstract values, but like embodied in a real person values. And so anyway, that's the exciting thing. We're actually building that right now. I'm gonna shut up. That was Andrea.
No,
Dav, even the way you just were talking about it and we're in the midst of designing this, it didn't occur to me because you and I also talk about AI and it as a tool. The way you just described that, I thought that sounds like someone building a customized bot. So I could ask, the Angela bot, what would you do? And there's probably an important corollary there. I think the simplification of all the complex information in a character and a story. I love starting there because that's more human. I'm working with other clients on bot design building in the HR space, so that we can really harness creative power within an organization. But I love the idea, just hearing you talk, it sprung to mind, like when you were building character and story and talking to it, and then it started to talk back to you in new and novel ways, that's when you knew you had something. And I think that's what we're starting to see with the potential of AI. So that's one thought there. And the other thing I think that's important to raise here with the character builder, for those of you out there who feel like, oh gosh, this is interesting, and I wish I had a little Dav to shake into my clients or how to think through this. An important element he and I talk about is our own give and take. There's a whole team at ArcX who's working with this client in particular, And it's not, we're in year 2 of probably a 3, maybe 4-year process. And it's multiple layers of listening and responding to them as a client. So when we walked in and we knew, I said, Dav, this is walking into a tense room, right? So this thing came up. It's going to be running in the background. We still have a job to do. Those are the responsive elements. Like we went in with a plan and then we had to honor where the team was at. This character builder, some might in like wonky OD speech, this is designing for the culture, that North Star, this is the culture that this organization is going to talk about in their onboarding, and this is what we're creating. And the executive director said, we're reimagining our mission, and we are going to reimagine our culture to meet mission as fast as we can. So this is the moment we're starting to design with everyone, because that was her hope, is let's do this together. So what we've done is brought tools and expertise and listening and responsiveness. They would not have been ready for this North Star conversation a year ago, because we had to work through some of the elements of culture, our rituals, our practices, and we had to really unpack and understand and learn on that microcosm level before we could even invite everyone. So every single person, we're using a bias minimization tool called Balloon. You can find it at Get Balloon, and it reduces bias, increases creativity at scale. And since they're all remote right now, as they're moving into a new building, that's the fodder that Dav will use in this character building experience that will be live and in the room. So there's this give and take that and responsiveness that Dav and I are often thinking about with the ArcX team and with this client's team to say, is this about right now? And we're doing that checking in all the time. And so there's not a linear process here. It's really having to be deeply tuned into the sense making of what's happening inside the client's realm.
Yeah, and that's I think a real key piece of, kind of going back to our original kind of setup for this conversation, which was the inside out, outside in culture building, which is there's a heightened sense of skill, I think, around responsiveness, intuition, things that can't quite always be measured in traditional ways, that makes leaders really uncomfortable. So what are some of the conversations you're having with leadership when you're, basically saying like, hey, we're not going to have all the answers up front. And there's also kind of a behavior change or a mindset shift that is also happening in the process. So Andrea and then Dav, any thoughts?
That's a great question. That reminds me of something Dav and I talked about, and we talk a lot in all of our engagements, is there is a first job we have, which is building trust as human beings with them. So sometimes that means let's design a small experience where they can see we heard them as an outside partner. And if that starts to feel like, okay, they're listening deeply, and they didn't come in with a shiny report that was given to the CEO, who then is going to enact a change process. But rather I'm big on us being in the room, sharing space. Proximity is the biggest driver of trust over all time and all cultures. So there still is space and time to be in a room together and to exchange some of what happens in a room. And it's those moments, I'll often say to a leader who's hiring us, part of this goal is for your team to trust us as a partner. So we are not coming in smarter than anyone else. We are coming in reflective. We will bring our expertise in at the right moments, at the right time, and we might have only 1 or 2 small goals that are born out of our expertise. And it's through that exchange that we build the right to continue to sense, and they're more vulnerable with us and more honest with us, that allows us to work with what's the real. So I would say the role of trust and building trust as an external consultant, I've been inside for most of my career. What I love about this phase of life is I can assemble teams with brilliant people who are just bringing analogous learning, different contexts, like Dav, coming from such a different world. It's such a breath of fresh air. And we can bring those tools to bear after we've built the trust. So that'd be my answer there. How about you, Dav?
I mean, I would say the same thing. The only tiny thing that I would say is I don't tell my clients nothing that they don't. I mean, I basically just reflect back. I listen, their same words, and I reflect it back because it's so much more powerful. They already know. They know the answers. They know what's up. They just sometimes you kind of hear it. You got to hear it from somebody else. You can't hear it from your own mouth. You got to hear it from coming from a different source. I think that's, well, I think, and that's I think work well together.
And I'd add one secret sauce element is, this is the boring side, but I believe in it deeply, is a lot of consultants will leave you with, what do you think? It's like the coaching model. All the answers are within. I'm a pragmatist as well. And sometimes I think if we were born and raised in this culture that reinforced hierarchy, that reinforced power and position and status as a proxy for who's right in the room. And if we went to school and the better degree you had afforded you more access to budget and to status, and then we're saying, you know what, though, really all the wisdom lives within you, that does leave them a little stuck. And we're big believers in something called skeletal muscular, like as we're listening, we're building and scaffolding structures that replace old ones. So we can't, it's not enough to say we're ripping out hierarchy. You have to replace that with new ways of working. So decision making, if it's not top down, we have to start teaching how to define and lead decision making, how to do advice rounds, consulting, commit rounds. And if you don't have that scaffolding and just leave it to training or just leave it to the wisdoms within, I think you're leaving your clients in a tough spot. And so we're kind of building as we go, knowing our schools and our places of work haven't yet taught us how to work in this future. And yes, there's wisdom in there, but we need to lift it up with some scaffolding and some skeletal structures. So I'd leave us with that notion of the tension of full system, like skeletal, muscular, and coming together and responding in that way.
And I know we're coming up on time, and I think we could just, oh my gosh, I have so many different paths we could go for a part 2 in this. But one of the things, and I want to have this be our last question before we move to like calls to action, like, how do people work with you? How do people get in contact? But the thing that I'm kind of landing on right now is a lot of what we're talking about, the concepts, everything from the character building and the scaffolding and these like iterative elements of building, the skeletal burst, everything we've talked about. These are things that happen in nature naturally. Like, I've been very much into biomimicking. This is probably a whole nother conversation, but it's interesting that nature does a lot of this naturally. And back to Dav's point around the flock, right? Like this natural kind of directional, but all signaling, parallel, working, overlapping. There's just this natural order of things that I think we need to pay more attention to. And so how does that conflict with something like AI, which is like the maybe, not the opposite, but it's meant to mimic, perhaps, or perpetuate structures that are maybe unnatural or inorganic. I know this wasn't planned in our list of questions, but I'm wondering how those two things kind of consolidate in your brain around the place that those things have in this work.
AI, I mean, what a great question. And I'm gonna freak out a little bit, but AI is largely a reflection of our own logic and thinking and writing and image making and all of that. So AI is really just kind of like a really fast synthesis of all that we've already done. I think really the really big difference between biomimicry and AI is that biomimicry is studying other systems and other ways of being and other knowledges and other epistemologies and other perspectives. And actually, I personally find it way more interesting. Like I've always long been more interested in artificial life, creating little new life forms and seeing how they grow and seeing how they react and respond to unpredictable and new environments. as opposed to just looking at what we've done over and over in our environment with all of our biases and all of our all the garbage that we have as humans. And so I think, to answer your question, I really think that biomimicry and looking towards other systems is actually a really great balance to AI, and that AI already know, and biomimicry and other types of systems are ones that we don't yet know. And I'm much more interested in that kind of inspiration. And I've always done that, brought inspiration from like film, like character, into org design or organizational culture.
Mm-hmm.
Weird thing, but it makes perfect sense to me. And that's my jam. That's what I really love. And so, in fact, there's a conference by Pioneers. There's one happening this month, just over. It's going to be really interesting. And what's interesting is, in fact, I just reached out at a call the other day with a biomimicry person, been working on products for a long time. And I was like, hey, have you ever used biomimicry for culture design? And she's like, yes, as a matter of fact. And I'm like, oh my God, can we please talk? So I honestly think that that's just much more interesting, and I'm excited about it. And let's definitely do another podcast on that.
Yeah, and I will say to that piece, Dav, it's so interesting hearing you. I've known you for so long and know your work. It makes intuitive sense that you were like, I'm interested in how like artificial life forms are, and then what is going on in the natural world. And it's so interesting. I mentioned I'm the youngest of 6 kids. I'm so not interested in that typically. I am like, what is going on really with the humans? Let's watch and let's understand and let's discern. And so I come at it more from a org psych background, or what is really happening. And so with AI entering the picture, it's really interesting because we are like living this, freaky future that I'm a child of the 70s and 80s, and here we are. But I also am a futurist and optimist thinking, okay, what's now? And I joke that I worked at Lucasfilm for 10 years, and I often would say, like, I don't like space. I'm not interested in space. Like, I'm interested in what's going on in this time, in this moment with the humans on this earth. So what for me is happening in AI is this is when I put on my HR bias minimization and equity anyway, fairness anyway hat. So I believe that and this is speaking to the HR designers of the world and leaders, if we feel like we have totally licked how to fairly decide who comes into our organization, who gets included in projects, who speaks, who gets leadership roles, then great. Let's let AI start to mimic how we do this. I believe we are not there. And I've spent a lot of my career looking at the research, often like Shelley Carell at Stanford, who really looks at how we give feedback to different groups and the quality of that feedback. Those systems aren't fair. They are objectively not yet fair. So my hope with AI is that we kind of blow the top off our current HR systems of how we make decisions about people. And we really design for fairness and then feed a machine to help us be less biased. It's a huge watch out in my world. And I really am trying to spend some time deeply on this. So I think we have to really understand, that we are biased because we're social human beings who needed short thinking about who was in and out group. But to interrupt that thinking, that can be done in a system. It does not have to be done through finger wagging and you got this wrong as a human. And so I'm excited about that kind of future where we can really start to speed up our decisions about people with less bias.
Amazing. And I think that's a great bow to tie in this conversation. Andrea and Dav, thank you so much for joining, for having the chat. Tell listeners where they can find you. We'll make sure to include in the show notes as well, so y'all can just click. Maybe Andrea, you can go first, and then Dav.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of LinkedIn. It's a great first start. Andrea Robb, and I lead a consulting company. We call it ArcX, and it's a talent design studio. You can find us at arcxconsulting.com. And Dav, how about you?
LinkedIn is a great way. Dav Rauch, Rauch. And I do have a website, davrauch.com, that is not yet up, but anyway, it's coming soon.
Yeah, we're gonna manifest it here, and
That's
if
right.
everyone is listening later, we'll make sure to put in the show notes regardless. So when it is up, they'll be ready to go.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much for your time.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. This was so fun.